All right, I think this will work this time. Hello, everybody. This is John Fenn, and this is part two, or actually, I'm going to redo the 666 Explained. I got cut off, amazingly enough, the failure of technology. I went from 5 bars LTE on my cell phone to 1 bar with 3 Gs. I think a squirrel committed suicide in the transmission line or something. So I'm going to kind of start over here, and my apologies for that. But because it's live, I'll probably cover stuff now that I didn't cover the first time. So thank you for bearing with me. The wonders of technology outside of our control. SupernaturalHouseChurch.org is our website. I'm going to say right up front that I've got a CD series. I'm not trying to sell a CD series. I'm just saying that I do have a CD series called Disasters of the Revelation, because when I'm talking about 666, it brings in the Revelation, and then I'll get emails from all sorts of questions. And in that series, Disasters of the Revelation, I go into the natural disasters that happened during the book of Revelation, a time to come, which include a double asteroid hit. One hits on the land, one hits in the water. It blocks out part of the sun and the moon and the stars, blocks out that. There's a whole dust cloud that comes up, and it causes all sorts of economic difficulty. There's poisoning of the fish, etc., etc. So if you're interested in going further, you can get that at our website, SupernaturalHouseChurch.org. But my main point today is 666. And explaining that. And what I was doing explaining earlier, if you saw a partial version, is the 666 represents 3 parts of man. That is, 6 is the number of man, so the highest form of power that man can have would be 666, which is to unify their kingdom politically, economically, and religiously. Now, I didn't explain economically before, and I'll do that real quick. Politically, we can understand that. Economically, I say economically because with economies go laws, and those laws are moral laws and the laws of a nation. And so it's understood that the legal aspect of it is understood in that second of the 666, the third part being religion. And what I started to say, and what I did in the earlier version, was talking about the 777, how 6 is the number of man, 7 is the number of the Lord. And how Jesus, when he rules and reigns on the earth from Zechariah chapter 14, says he'll be king over the whole earth, thus unifying the earth politically. But it also said, and of course with that politics goes the righteousness of economics, of moral law, etc., that Jesus will enforce. Righteousness will rule on the earth. And so that's the second one, the 7-7, and then the third 7 is worship. So if Jesus is the type, is the prototype, he is the perfection, he is the 777, he is going to be king over the earth. He is politically, economically, and religiously. Zechariah 14 says that all the nations of the earth will come up to Jerusalem to worship him during the Feast of Tabernacles. Tabernacles is the only one of the 7 biblical festivals that will be fulfilled on an ongoing basis. And every year the nations will go up and worship him at the Feast of Tabernacles. And in fact, Zechariah chapter 14 says, for instance, it uses a hypothetical situation. If the family of Egypt does not want to come up to worship him, then upon them there will be no rain. It says that is the plague wherewith he will hit them if they don't come up to worship him. So, it's going to be an enforced righteousness, because there will be people who aren't born again on the earth that make it through the tribulation, etc., and Jesus will be king and they won't like it. That's why you and I are going into government service. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6:2, says we will judge angels, we'll judge the world. That's not talking about judge right and wrong, heaven, hell. That's an administrative term. In other words, we will have administrative powers over angels and over the world during that time. But I don't want to get sidetracked. So I talked about how the Apostle John in 1 John chapter 3, chapter 4, etc., talks about the spirit of Antichrist already loose in the earth. Man has always sought to put together a 666. He's always wanted to unify whatever kingdom he rules over politically, and then economically with the laws that go with it, and then religiously. And you can go down through history. You can look at the Roman Empire. And that's specifically what the Apostle John was talking about in the book of Revelation when he said, no man can buy or sell without the mark on their forehead or their wrist. And in Roman times, they would they'd take away their name, and when they made you a slave, they branded you either on your forehead or on your wrist. And so you didn't have a name. And so the biblical, you can see this in the Bible in Romans chapter 16, verses 22 and 23. And it's a good trivia if you want to have fun with your friends. Ask who wrote the book of Romans. They'd say Paul, and they'd be wrong. Because Romans, like some of Paul's letters, he dictated it. And so in Romans 16:22, the secretary, Tertius, writes, and he says, I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you in the Lord, as does Erastus, the city's treasurer, and Quartus, a brother. That's Romans chapter 16, 22 and 23. And the word tertius is the Roman numeral 3, and quartus is the Roman numeral 4. So they were not Paul's slaves, they were slaves of the Roman Empire. And Paul, under house arrest and different things like that, had these gentlemen to help serve him, as well as the city's treasurer of Corinth, because he wrote to Rome from the city of Corinth. Anyway, so you see that in the New Testament. And my point in this is that if you go down through Nebuchadnezzar, look at Nebuchadnezzar, he unified his rule over politics and economic and everything he had, but also religion. And Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego at various times fell into disfavor because of the religion. In the Apostle John's time, an image was set up. Domitian was the Caesar, and he declared himself to be a god. So everyone had a statue of Domitian, and you had to swear, yes, he is a god. Christians refused to do that. That's why Revelation 12 talks about they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, that is their salvation, and by the word of their testimony. The word of their testimony was, we will not bow down to Domitian. We will not confess that he is a god. Jesus alone is God. And they overcame him in their deaths by their salvation and the confession of their mouth to acknowledge that they were in fact belonging to the Lord. And so you see this all the way along down through history. Daniel had to bow down. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the same thing. There's look at what's happening especially for Americans. Look at what's happening right now. Is that Christians and conservatives are being put on the outside, being marginalized. There's pictures in the news about shops and stores and restaurants putting up signs saying who they support and who they don't support. And of course, they want everyone to be acknowledged, everyone to be accepted, except Christians, except conservatives. And the Roman Empire, especially in the Apostle John's time, also put out misinformation. They misunderstood because Christians did not, bow down to the gods and everything else. So they were viewed as weird and some offshoot that were dangerous. And those times are always there. That's always there. Whether you look at communist China, whether you look at USSR, Nazi Germany, you go back to Rome, you go all the way through. The believers are marginalized and put out. And so that's why the 666 is important in the book of Revelation. Because like Nazi Germany, for instance, if you look at some of the old footage, you see signs in the store windows that says Jews not allowed. Well, if you have this mark and that is the only way that you can buy something at the store, that means you have to depend on one another. You have to depend on gardens and food stores and stuff like that because, and your supplies, you've got to trade and barter between yourselves because you're not allowed to be in the system, to take part of the system, unless you pledge allegiance to that future king and that future system. So there's a lot of questions because people are seeing more and more implants. They're talking about cashless societies. There's a nation that's not recognized by any nation. I think it's Somaliland or something that's cashless. An article in the news, Sweden is going cashless by and large. Everything electronic. There's nothing evil in and of itself, but what happens is, in the book of Revelation, it says that there will come a system that will be tied to the allegiance of a governmental entity. And if you do not pledge that allegiance to that governmental entity, you will be portrayed as being treasonous, and treason is worthy of death. So there's not the danger in the 666 in terms of right now at this time. We can look at chips being implanted. We can look at cards with, plastic cards with chips in it and stuff like that. The danger's coming sometime in the future when the economic transaction is tied to the allegiance to the system. And that's where you get the 666. The political system, the economic system, and the religious system will all combine together to try to break apart, to try to be 1/3 of that without being the other 2/3 of it will be shown as treasonous. And that's what the Apostle John is talking about in the book of Revelation. So, all right, I hope this got to you all the way. Unlike the first one I cut off, and I covered some things in that first 6 minutes before it got cut off, and I'm covering some things now in this almost 10 minutes in this. But the thing is, nothing to fear for right now. We watch, we pray. I really don't think we're going to be around. I believe Rosh Hashanah teaches the Feast of Trumpets, which is the catching away of the church. At that time, but at the same time, we watch and pray and we want to be wise. So it's interesting to see what happens, but I'm not afraid of it. Remember, the 666 stands for a ruler that will try to unify politically, economically, and religiously. And so watch for that spirit at work. Look for the spirit to separate out, to marginalize those who don't believe what the party line is or what the governmental line is. And if you believe differently from what the governmental line is, if you're separated and don't believe what that governmental line is, you'll be marginalized. And at some future point, that spirit will increase to the point where it could be a life or death situation. Because the future ruler wants all three of them combined: religious, political, and economic, all three combined. All right, God bless. Talk to you next week.